Hello, English 385, American literature students, Dr. Evertson here. I'm recording this at home, and as promised, I said I would go over some of the Emily Dickinson poems that got a lot of love and attention and critical discussion in the forum that you did last week when I was absent from class. And normally we would have gone over quite a few of these poems as much as time would allow in class. And in the past, I have had to also continue some discussion on outside of the class and in these sort of like Zoom videos. And I'll try and keep this as brief as I can, but I make no promises because I love Emily Dickinson. Um, and I'm so sad that we weren't able to sort of spend more time talking about her in class and going through her poems. So hopefully for those of you who are a glutton for punishment, you can stick with this examination and exploration a little bit more fully. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen here and just talk in an overview about um, the uh, the forum itself. You guys did a really good job um, addressing the. I can't see. Do I have the forum? I had it opened here at one point. The forum responses. I thought you did a really nice job on these. Um, but there was a couple things that we didn't quite get to in class. And also, it's always interesting to see where a group of students winds up finding a track or an emphasis or interest. There was a lot more exploration in the forum about tombs and graves and the Truth and Beauty poem. We'll talk about that here in a second. And I was also reminded by several of the posts, Abigail's post in particular, that we probably didn't talk enough about the what we might call the feminist aspects of Emily Dickinson's poetry. And there's so many poems to choose from and select. This group of poems that we're sort of going through was kind of handed to me when I was a graduate student with these divisions of language and the role of the poet, love and desire, pain and death, and I had some really great professors who had published books on Dickinson, and but they were all dudes. And I do think it's interesting that the selection that we wound up going through maybe has a certain sort of emphasis or trend that is sort of male centric or doesn't always address some of those. I'm going to try and keep that in mind and be open to exploring that more fully in our class this semester and with these poems in particular. So let's get to it. If we start with language and the role of poet, I do want to start here because I think this was an important element and a distinction that was brought forth in the discussion of publication. And so we'll take a look at a couple of the poems here and at least one part of the letter to Higginson that I think addresses some of these elements. So let's go ahead and click in here on the packet of poems and bear with me here as I try and find the correct poems here. So I'll be pausing this Zoom recording from time to time as I try and sort of get my stuff together here. So in order to do that, I need to go up here and pun. Okay, how do I get my screen to be shared again? Sorry, I'm trying to figure out my technology here. Okay, I think I downloaded the handout and now when I was trying to maximize the screen in Canvas, it was kicking me out of screen sharing. So here we go. Let's talk a little bit about some of these poems here. The first one that we had that is in this tranche of poems about language and the role of the poet. I think it is interesting as I made a big deal out of the fascicles and how Dickinson had bound these poems up after she had sort of made some attempts to sort of see what people thought about them. And I admire very much sort of her artistic commitment where she didn't really want to alter or change her poems. I think she knew that she had something significant going there. And so it's just amazing. We have this correspondence with Higginson and others where we discuss the development of her poetry. But for the most part, a lot of her poems, and if you do go to the Amherst House, the Dickinson House in Amherst, they have some wonderful displays there where they show her revision process. And in our text here, towards the end especially, we have a lot of those Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers poems that were exchanged with Susan Gilbert, and she was getting feedback on those, right? And so we can see how she is adapting and changing those poems as she goes along. So she did have a revision process, but we also use Dickinson as a shorthand in poetry discussion to say how important those visual elements on the page, the dashes and the punctuation that we might find, it wasn't accidental. It's like what Twain said at the beginning of Huck Finn. He's working with these dialects and he wants people to know he's not just trying to he's just, messing it up or botching it. It's intentional. And so we want to think about a poet and their vision is pretty intentional in the way that the poems are supposed to be punctuated. So there's been a lot of sort of discussion over the years about how much to edit and how much was intentional from Dickinson's part. I think the fact that she set these aside and wasn't that interested in changing them is an indication that she felt there was something significant both in what she was saying and how she was saying it and how it appears on the page. Um, so on this poem, in this language and the role of the poet, the other thing that comes up with Dickinson from the biography elements is, that she was this recluse and she had this very narrow sort of worldview because she was stuck in Amherst. We already went through this in class. She was an intellectual and she read a great deal. And so even though she didn't travel widely and she had kind of as she said, a worldview and an experience that was subscribed or was circumscribed, right? Her world is circumference, as she says in that one letter. Within that circumference, she was examining the human condition through herself and trying to express these things in a way that I think reaches out across the ages. And they don't sound dated, do they? Unless there's some, archaic term that she mentions in her poem. I mean, these poems could have been written, last week because they're dealing with these eternal ideas. And as an artist, and as a recluse and someone who wasn't married and didn't have children, and so therefore didn't follow this conventional path of what we think of as, a conventional life story of a family and all that sort of stuff. That it's interesting that her artistry and her independence becomes the watchword that we really pay attention to with the way that she's setting up these poems, particularly in this part where she's discussing about her social interactions and her relationship with her poetry and the way it speaks to the world. So we have a poem like this, I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us, don't tell, they'd advertise, How dreary to be somebody, how public like a frog, to tell one's name to the livelong June, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. And we could interpret that a number of ways. It's ironic, though, that she's saying being nobody makes you like many others, thus a somebody, right? So, in our nobodiness, in our individual, we are the bulk of society, are the people that are just working their day-to-day lives. She's living her day-to-day life. She's writing these poems often off on her own. She's setting them aside. She's not trying to make a living as a writer. She's not trying to make a living as a poet. And she's expressing here, yeah, the voice of the poem, I think, is expressing a sentiment that is, if you were widely known and admired for your work, particularly in the time that you're alive and can appreciate all that attention, it has positives and negatives. And maybe after the fact, maybe she doth protest too much. Maybe she really does desire fame. But if we're going to look at the poems themselves, and if we conflate the voice of these poems with the poet, and they're such personal poems set aside in her bedroom drawer, we kind of have to say there's probably a voice of the poet coming through in this lines. And I think it does speak to the idea that she, at least after the fact, says she desires her barefoot rank, right? She doesn't want to be a somebody. She doesn't want to be known as that. And because you are reduced to being like a frog chorus, selling your stuff to an admiring bog or whatever. It's kind of interesting. And the next one is This is my letter to the world. Let's see if I can find that. 519, right? This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. We talked about this a little bit in class, but I think it really sort of ties in nicely again with this sentiment about whether she had an ambition to publish or not. And to me, I see the poem being written in a way that is in the same spirit of these poems being set aside. This poem itself is a letter, and a letter implies a correspondence. And a letter, traditional letters that are put in the dispatch or put in the mail and sent off, are meant to land in your mailbox and then you receive it. And when you open it up, it expresses the sentiment of the person who sent it. So Dickinson, across the eras, across the ages, confident in her talent as a poet, sends us this letter in the form of this poem, but maybe it could also stand for all her poems, right? Or just in general, her position in society. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. And we have that conflation or dual notion there at the end again, right? Where we talked about how the bird bit the angleworm in half. And was the bird cautious, or was the voice in the poem trying to give the crumb to the bird, the one who was being cautious? In this same sense, who is the for love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me? Her message is committed. Who is the her in this poem? Probably the way we would most likely transact this is by saying, this is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, a one-way poem, a one-way communication. I'm trying to sort of impart my sense of nature. Some keep the Sabbath going to church, I keep mine staying home, right? So this idea of earth church or the church of nature, as embodied in her poetry, but also maybe her experiences as a human being within the context of the natural world. Is that the message? Is that the letter that she's trying to sort of transcribe across the ages? The simple news that nature told. Sometimes students will read that not as nature, it is a capitalized nature, but maybe it's not like I'm looking out the window now at the birds at the feeder and the trees, and is that the nature she has in mind, or is it the world around us that we all live in, our uh, our ecology, our home. It doesn't necessarily have to necessarily be birds and bees, but if it is an idea that her poetry captures something of her place in the universe or her place in nature, she's asking the readers to judge tenderly of me. The message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, that's always the confusing part. For love of me, Emily Dickinson, for love of the message that I've committed about nature, judge tenderly of me. It just is all an interesting meta, self-referential idea of what the role of the poet is in society. This brings us to our most important poem in this bunch. Publication is the auction of the mind of man. So, in this poem, it's probably the most explicit statement of her attitude towards publication. And it is interesting how, oh, we should back up a little bit here. We don't do enough of this some of the times. I was going to tell you some things about this poem that we just finished. This is my letter to the world, 519, that there's some things going on here with the sound sense. So we were just talking about this in English 250 today, critical approaches to literature. Um, we should probably at some point take time in class to scan these lines. And if we were in the classroom, I would do this and I would try and point out where the beats and the stresses are in this poem. But in this poem, I believe we have, let me look at my notes here, iambic tetrameter, right? So we have 4 beats per line, and it's followed by trimeter. So this is the hymn meter or ballad meter that we hear so much about with Dickinson. It's not in every one of her poems, but you do have that 4/3 beat. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. The simple news that nature told, there's a stress on each of those, the feet there, and that's why you're getting the iambic tetrameter, iambic trimeter, the three beat structure that follows. The simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Now, if you don't want to deal with that technical language, it's fine, but keep in mind what happens with the slightly longer line followed by the slightly shorter line. It has that song rhythm, but also, this is my letter to the world. You can sort of see it how it's being poured out. That never wrote to me is sort of a shorter sentiment because she's expressing all these views and ideas outward towards the world. A longer line is needed to sort of contain or entertain that notion, followed by, well, you never wrote back to me, right? And also, we make some distinctions when we read these poems with the enjambment, right? Where you carry over on the other line. So it's a performance depending on how you want to read the poem. So keep that in mind. You could read this poem since there's no indication in the punctuation, which is why her editors probably wanted to put those punctuation marks in. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, would be another way to sort of express it. The simple news that nature told, with tender majesty, her message is committed to hands I cannot see. Then it's broken up for love of her, sweet countrymen. So maybe there's something going on with the long line length that is keyed in as well with the content of the poem. So if we go back to publication is the auction of the mind of man. A couple of things that we sort of think about this poem as a statement of her idea of publishing, but it is also a commentary, perhaps, on the analogy she's drawing with a slave auction. And maybe you find this distasteful, but in the comparison between an artist and their creation, and let's say, as she said, this is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, um, that it's a sentiment or an encapsulation of nature or one's place in the universe, right? An important idea about our humanity, and you're trying to put a price on that. It's the same sort of distasteful, disgusting attitude you might have about trying to put a price on a human life, as in bondage, as in slavery. So let's read through the poem. Publication is the auction of the mind of man. Poverty be justifying for so foul a thing, possibly, but we would rather from our garret go white unto the white Creator than invest our snow. Thought belonged to him who gave it, then to whom who bear its corporeal illustration. Sell the royal air. In the parcel be the merchant of the heavenly grace, but reduce no human spirit to disgrace of price. There's a lot of very complicated syntax there. And um, the pauses, the dashes, the way that it is, it's kind of a little bit hard to get into, and so you have to analyze it sort of line by line. But in general, do you notice the imagery she's using there that strikes a materialist view? She's pointing out like a parcel, um, like how can you sell something as vital as my artistic expression? It's a part of me in the same way that you might put a slave in an auction and try and sell that body. That's where the corporeal, which is what that word means, right? Corporeal means body. That's where that sort of idea comes into it. So let's back up a little bit. Publication is the auction of the mind of man. Maybe you could, you know, justify selling your poetry, selling your short stories or whatever, if that's the only way you could make a living. Emily Dickinson living with her family, she has her room, she has her board, she's fine. She doesn't need to earn a living, so to speak, as an artist, as a writer. She has the privilege and the resources and able to just be pure in her art. And so at least she's acknowledging that some people may not have that privilege, right? Um, Again, there could be some sort of after the fact going back and saying, well, this is why I never published my poems, when it seems like we see with the letters with Dickinson and others that the poems at times are being rejected because people didn't totally get them. And so um, her poems have stood the test of time, probably better that she didn't auction them off or sell them into bondage like a slave, because who knows what would have happened once they're out of her sort of control as an artist. She has no say over what happens. She has no agency, which is the dilemma of someone who's in human bondage. They have no agency over their own lives. So she envisions her poems almost like children. Imagine a slave mother having to give up their child and have it go out into the public and be at the whim of somebody else's use. Um, but poverty be justifying for so foul a thing, possibly, she says. Even then, she's not sure. But we, and who is the we? Capital We, capital W we. But we would rather from our garret go white. And so when we talk about this in class, when we have more time to talk about in class, we have a spirited discussion about what we means. I like to think about we as the tribe of creatives or the artists or the people who do not want to sell their soul, so to speak. But this collective we, these are the people who see you cannot put a price on art. That's obviously not true, but this is the sentiment of the poem, right? We would rather from our garret go. So a garret in this regard is a room, and we think about her up in her room. We also know that the etymology of that word garret and garrison kind of comes from the same arena, and knowing that this is roughly in the midst of the Civil War, which is being fought over slavery, you might think about whether this garret or garrison sort of imagery is martial, that is, it has some sort of war intonations. It certainly is describing this sort of obscene marketplace that we align with slavery. Um, so, but we would rather from our garret go white. White is always kind of a difficult circumstance here. And you think about how the poet could have expressed this in a more clear way, but that's not how Dickinson does it. And she likes, white is an adjective. It describes an absence of color. It could describe, society that is not slave, right? So maybe it has double meaning in this analogy with the slave auction, but we would rather from our garret go white. In this case, I think because it comes up a little bit later that this is suggesting purity, right? I will not sully the purity, the cleanness of my poetry by putting a price on it. Unto the white creator, right? But we would rather from our garret go white unto the white creator. If you want to read way too much into this, you could say this is Dickinson sort of declaring on the page, imagining that somebody would read it years hence, which we are doing, right? So her prophecy is fulfilled. And she's saying, I would rather die than sell the soul of my poetry, right? I would rather go into the white creator than invest, another business term being applied to something that you would say that's very crass to apply a monetary value or a business venture towards poetry or writing. Unto the white creator then invest our snow. What? What does she mean, our snow? And the only thing we can think about is she's continuing that metaphor of the whiteness, the purity, right? Rather than invest our snow, these pure thoughts, these pure poems, the rather than invest our snow, and there's kind of an end there, that part of the poem. So then she says, thought belonged to him who gave it. And back to the feminist issue, isn't it interesting that the collective pronoun there, um, uh, not the collective program, the personal pronoun there is gendered, it's male. So even Dickinson, in the midst of writing about how precious her expressions of her soul, of her body are, she sees them in sort of masculine terms, or she imagines, or she imagines the reader is going to expect a male poet, right? But in her day, she's just thinking maybe about humans in general. Thought belonged to him who gave it. Then, next, right? Not then otherwise, but then to him who bear its corporeal illustration. Corporeal meaning body, the bodily illustration. And here do you see the connection here where she's saying these poems It's very brilliant the way she's described it because she doesn't come right out and say it, but she's saying, my poems are like the bodies you see on display at a slave auction. I'm not going to sell them off. And the corporeal illustration of a poem is this idea that we saw in the other poems where she's saying, I'm infusing all of this into me, into my body. I'm expressing it in a poem. I'm setting it aside. It's going to be read years hence and resurrected, and it will come back to life. And it's like a bodily resurrection of the ideas and thoughts of her time. Walt Whitman had the same sort of idea, only he just went on and was very explicit in his poetry about how I'm writing all these things down so that you can learn about them future. And he talks to the readers directly, right? So there is something about this romantic movement at the this period of time that Dickinson's writing in, where there really was this idea of connecting across the eras, across the ages, and resurrecting these thoughts, right? And in that case, how could you put a price on something so special, precious, right? And once you let go of the body, in the same way you sell a body in a slave auction, you no longer have control over it, right? Thought belonged to him who gave it, then to him who bare its corporeal illustration, it would be better off to try and sell the royal heir. Like, try and think about as a poet, what is the thing I could try and talk about that is both precious and ineffable, something that can't be contained, something that you can't distill down to a material thing that you could, sell or buy, right? So the material thing here is the poem, but the material thing of the poem is not really what matters. It's what's expressed when you read it as a reader. And that connection between the reader and the poet is the magic that you can't put a price on, right? It's like I said, that resurrection of the body, that resurrection of the thought. Um, in the parcel, so parcel I think we think of as a package. In the package, be the merchant of the heavenly grace. And you think about in the Bible or in the Christian tradition, there's not a lot of love for people who are making a ton of money or rich people or materialists. There's love for people who express love and have more of a spiritual goal in mind, right? So this idea of using merchant, business terms, banking terms, it's clearly loaded in this idea of reducing something as important as poetry and ideas to some sort of price. Um, be the merchant of the heavenly grace, but reduce no human spirit to disgrace of price. Reduce no human spirit to disgrace of price. In the parcel, be the merchant of the heavenly grace. So if you're going to have to sell something, you do not want to be a slave auctioneer. You don't want to be profiting over the exploitation of people's bodies. You don't want to be profiting by selling poems. You want to be the merchant of the heavenly grace. You want to meet the poem where it's meant to be meant with grace, with a gift. And I think that's the main here, not commerce, but a gift. Something like that. That's usually how that discussion goes. I did want to sort of circle back to some of the letters here because what she writes in her letter to Higginson is important. Here, let's see if I can find it. Um, she uses this term, will you be my preceptor? And we're told that a preceptor is like a tutor, but particularly in like an anatomy class, like when you're studying medicine and you need somebody to guide you through an autopsy or dissection or that sort of thing. So it's interesting how we're back to this notion of the poem, and the metaphor here is that these poems are like her body. And when Higginson dissects her poems, he's dissecting her body in some ways. And she's kind of into it, right? But at the end of the day, it's her body, her choice, to use a modern sort of idea. So she says, your letter gave no drunkenness. I've tasted rum before. I've been through this before. She talks about her dying tutor here. That's glossed in the footnote a little bit. Your second letter surprised me, and for a moment I swung. I had not supposed it. Your first gave no dishonor because the true are not ashamed. I thank you for your justice, but could not drop the bells whose jingling cooled my tramp. Perhaps the balm seemed better because you bled me first. Again, all images of, you know, visiting the doctor, having a procedure done, being bled out, having your life force bled out, that sort of thing. I smile when you suggest that I delay to publish in quotation marks. That being formed to my thought as firmament to fin. If fame belonged to me, I could not escape her. If she did not, the longest day would pass me on the chase, and the approbation of my dog would forsake me. Then my barefoot rank is better. I think we're back to that notion of I'm nobody, who are you? Let's be a tribe of nobodies. Who wants to chirp or sing to an admiring bog like a frog in the bog, that sort of thing. So we definitely have this reiteration of this at least expressed idea that she doesn't want to publish. But keep in mind, we do have in the book these poems that she was sending out to people she trusted for correspondence. And she did make changes based on some of these, poems that went back and forth we see in letter form. Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers is the poem that is used in our textbook to illustrate this. So we don't want to be too reductive in the way we think about Dickinson, but she does have a lot of poems and letters that express a sentiment that she's not interested in publication. The other thing that I think I glossed over a little bit too much in class, but it is this notion, and I always misstate this because it's an important distinction. It's not tell the truth, but tell it slant. It's tell all the truth. So that's an important distinction. And probably should have been clear about that in class. You can't shade things, you can't hold things back. Everybody needs to know the whole truth, but there's ways that you can deliver this whole truth in a way that won't be crippling or cruel, right? Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. We're back to that notion of the circle, or her life is in circumference, as she describes in that letter. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit, like, don't you love that alliteration? Success in circuit lies. But it's such a brilliant idea, isn't it? Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Is there a pun going on there? We'd like to talk about that in class at times. So, success in circuit lies. And if you're telling the truth but telling it slant, is that like a white lie? It's the truth, but it's shaded. Is it a shaded lie? Success in circuit, somehow with a kind of lying, perhaps. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise, as lightning with the children eased with explanations kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. The other thing that's interesting in this poem is that you have the dash at the very start and you have the dash at the end. A lot of times when these dashes are at the end of the poem, you get this sort of almost an ellipsis, like it continues on after the final thought of the poem. And in this idea of success and circuit lies, it's just a perpetual sort of mission to sort of tell all this truth, but tell it in a way that people can handle it, right? In the same way that you might explain lightning to a child. There's no other sort of clear punctuation or where we would put the caesura or the pauses. So you can read this poem however you want. We might ask ourselves why the poet doesn't want us to have any direction on where to stop those things. I think the circular rhythm of the poem is part of that, but that's another thing we could discuss more fully. Okay, let's pause here and I'm going to take a look at the next tranche or grouping of poets. So I'm going to pause here and regroup. Okay, let's talk about love and desire, right? So let me make sure I'm recording here. I think I'm recording. Are we recording? Okay, we are recording, hopefully. All right. So now we enter the section where we talk about love and desire. So in literature, when we talk about well, what the distinction there being this idea of maybe the spiritual connection of love, but also a lot of literature is interested in the physical act of love and sex, and we oftentimes use the term desire for to sort of intone that sort of physical aspect. And as much as we think of Emily Dickinson as this recluse, maybe even a prude or something like that. We have learned over the years through her correspondence and other things that she seems to have had some really passionate relationships. And in this day and age where we're into AI and some people are falling in love with Chat GPT or Grok or whoever, that it is not as crazy to think that you could have an intense desire, and almost physical like relationship through correspondence. And we see a lot of very passionate correspondence from Dickinson to a variety of people. And we do have indications that she traveled and at times met with people. So there was probably some physical interactions with both men and women, certainly very strong emotional attachments that we would characterize as love or loving feelings or desire. And so we know that she was not this isolated prude up in her bedroom. And we see in poems, obviously, a nun who is has devoted herself to being wedded only to Christ and has never had the carnal knowledge, that term of having slept with another person. They could still imagine and write about it in strong poetry. So we can't say definitively that these poems are autobiographical. But if you see a poem where she's exploring something like this, hopefully you get the sexiness of what she's describing. Wild nights, wild nights. This is not iambic pentameter, iambic tetrameter or trimeter. It's not ballad. It's like do, do, do. It's like I'm into this. Wild nights, exclamation point. Not a ton of exclamation points in her poetry. So when we see it, we really remark upon it. Wild nights, wild nights. Were I with thee, the subjunctive, right? If I were with you, wild nights would be our luxury. And we have to think about who the who is here. It could be just a straight story of two lovers. It could be the poet to the reader, and she's invading our physical space. Walt Whitman does it all the time, by the way, when he's hugging us across the centuries. Feudal, the winds to a heart in a port. Done with the compass, done with the chart. Rowing in Eden, ah, the sea, might I but more tonight in thee. Interesting sort of juxtaposition there with all the nautical terms, right? Feudal, the winds can't keep my boat from going where it needs to go. And here the physical imagery, if you get what I'm talking about here, the boat sliding into the port is meant, I think, to have both a physical and a spiritual sense of connection. That's why might I but more tonight in thee, the sea, but also with the lover, it's two things can be true at the same time, two things at once. Um, this idea, it expresses such a sexy idea of, oh man, I'm separated from you, but I really, because remember, were I with thee? So it's expressing a longing and a desire that's not going to happen because, these the voice in the poem, these two people are separated. The boat is not going to the dock tonight, unfortunately. There might be some self-sailing that's going to have to occur in other words, if you know what I mean. So the other one that I think is really a sort of interesting poem is The Soul Selects Her Own Society. And I'll try and go through these as quickly as I can. But these are all sort of dealing with sort of this idea of society or potentially physical relationships, lovers, emotional relationships as well. And it's interesting how she describes or personifies the soul in this poem, right? Because it can be sort of a spiritual connection, it can be a physical connection. It can also, it doesn't necessarily have to be, probably our first blush at this is not that it's about sex or desire, but about companionship or maybe society makes me think about your friend group, right? But here we have an interesting juxtaposition of long beats followed by quick, short, accented sections, right? And there's also this idea of a great importance, all the royal imagery, all that sort of stuff is associated with friendship. And this might come back again to that feminist issue that we were talking about, where probably for women, companionship of this very sort of intimate, close-knit, you're not sad to say, but you're not running the college like Emily's dad was. Um, you're not a professor at the college like her brother was. You're in a more sort of restrained role, a domestic space, and therefore the friendships and things that you carry on outside of that are extremely significant. And or you can think about this as also a spiritual connection, but it's interesting how she's describing a soul selecting society. Society is what we associate with human beings, right? Soul, I think we think of as not a person, but as the spiritual element within our bodies, if you believe in such a thing. And so and then you have the alliteration, and you have a lot going on with the sound sense of this poem as well. The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door. Do you see how the dashes and the short line following the long line shows this kind of, however you want to put it, we can be picky about who we let into our entrance, who we let into our lives, who we let into our physical space, who we want to hang out with, who we share our important information with, who we confide with, maybe who we're physical with, right? Who we're affectionate with. So keep that in mind as you're reading through the poem. The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door to her divine majority, present no more. Sometimes people will gloss that word present no more. You know, presented at court, presented at the doorway of our society that you're going to allow somebody in. I always think of a door where somebody comes in or out and you're just deciding who is going to be granted access, who has the password. As Whitman would put the password primeval to enter into that space, right? Um, present no more. The other thing is with the formal system of calling and domestic spaces and parlors and things like that, there's this thing about the calling card where when people would come to visit, they'd bring their very ornate calling card. And we'll see this when we read The Awakening, the little dish by the door where people leave their calling cards. And especially if you're from the upper class, you usually have a servant who answers the door. And if you're not at home, they'll take the calling card and they'll put it in the receptacle there at the door. And if you are at home, the servant will go up and see if you can be bothered, right? And so there really is this sort of formal class structure about who's allowed to visit and who's in and who's out, who's in the friends group and who's out, who's in the clique and who's not. Okay, so somebody presents their card. Unmoved, she notes the chariots pausing at her low gate. Unmoved, an emperor kneeling upon her mat. Interesting juxtapositions there. Let me pause here for a second. Apologize, I had a frog in my throat there. Unmoved, she notes the chariots pausing at her low gate. Unmoved, an emperor kneeling upon her mat. Some see this as sort of sexual references. Um, Also, continuation of this idea of the elite. She wants this connection with attention. She wants these society people to come to her low door and meet with her, but she's going to be very selective on who she lets in to her door, right? Again, spiritually, in a soul sense, in a physical sense, like who is she going to let into her life, into her intimate life, maybe into her physical life? Who is she going to be allowed to be her lover? Um, it could be an emperor, but she's not impressed by the voice in the poem. The speaker's not impressed by titles or class status, but something else. However difficult it is that middle stanza to unpack. There's something about very fancy people coming to the door and they may or may not get in. Just because you have a high pedigree doesn't mean you get to be in my life. Something like that, perhaps. Um, uh, I've known her from an ample nation, choose one. Then close the valves of her attention like stone. That is a stunning last stanza. Um, this is what success in circuit lies, right? Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. I love how she's getting at that notion by not directly addressing it and trying to sort of impart in language whatever this idea is. The heart wants what it wants. Companionship is what it is. Friendship can't be forced, right? So I've known her. Who do you think the her is here? I think we have to go back to the antecedent, which would be the soul, the personified soul. That's the her. I've known her from an ample nation. Choose one. The soul chooses one. Again, who knows why we connect? Choose one. I like the short line there. Choose one dash imparts the notion of selecting one. Then close the valves of her attention. And we talk about this in class. What a weird way to put that. The valves of her attention. What valves is she talking about? Is she talking about a mechanical valve? She's mentioned doorways. Valves are usually one way in sort of thing, right? You let the water through, or you let the blood through your heart. Is she describing the valves of her attention being aligned with the valves of the heart? Um, the valves of the soul. Um, that image of the fluid being allowed to come in or out, turning on or off the faucet is quite interesting. I like the association with the heart, right? Then close the valves of her attention. And then, as a poet, a brilliant poet, she could say, like, shutting the door. Well, how do you get this idea of, nope, you're out? Then by saying, I close my valves like stone, right? Like stone. It's so Dickinson. It's such a unique way of sort of getting that idea of slamming the door. She doesn't want to write slam the door. She wants to say, I close the valves of my attention like stone. End of story, right? Um, so that's quite an interesting sort of array of images to try and sort of get through. Many of you brought up my favorite Dickinson poem. Um, I started early, took my dog. So this is 656. And this poem, not, you know, TMI perhaps, but when I got married, uh, the person who was my dissertation advisor uh, also served as the officiant or minister at my wedding at the top of Ragged Point in California, which is near San Simeon, or along the Big Sur area of the California coast there. We hiked up to the top of this Forest Service trail up to a very high sort of hill or mountain overlooking the ocean, and we had the ocean in the distance. Uh, and Brenda and I, when we got ready to exchange our vows, unbeknownst to each other, we wrote our own vows. We both referenced this poem, and it seems like a weird poem to see as a romantic sentiment, but it just really moved us in the way that this voice in this poem is moved by perhaps again a physical representation of love and desire, another person, a companion, a soulmate, but also perhaps with a spiritual connection or even just a connection with nature. But regardless, it's a very sexy and loving poem in and of itself. In her letters, she talks about the dog being the most important thing in her life, this big old dog. And we have to think about, where is this beach that Emily Dickinson is descending to? If you've been to Amherst, there are no beaches around Amherst. If you go towards Boston, Amherst is not that far from Boston. Now you're getting up against the coast, but they're not typically swimming beaches, right? But so this is an example of how maybe the biography of the author is part of an imaginative journey. And so within that sense, let's look at the overall imagery. I started early, took my dog, and visited the sea. The mermaids in the basement came out to look at me, and frigates in the upper floor extended hempen hands, presuming me to be a mouse aground upon the sands. But no man moved me, till the tide went past my simple shoe, and past my apron and my belt, and past my bodice too, and made as he would eat me up as wholly as a dew upon a dandelion sleeve. And then I started too. And he followed close behind. I felt his silver heel upon my ankle. Then my shoes would overflow with pearl. Until we met the solid town, no one he seemed to know, and bowing with a mighty look at me, the sea withdrew. So, in one sense, quite literally, this is an encounter with the ocean, and the ocean is personified as another person, in this case, a man, I believe. Um, the dog is interesting. I started early, took my dog and visited the sea. The mermaids in the basement came out to look at me. Mermaids, it's kind of interesting. We think of the Little Mermaid, but the folk tales around mermaids is they are quite treacherous and they lure people into the sea and drown them. And so there's a little bit of attraction slash threat. That's the metaphor here, right? The sirens or the mermaids in the ocean, they're beautiful, they're attractive, they call you out, but they're also dangerous. They can kill you. Okay, so And visited the sea is interesting too, because there's a sense that she's not going there all the time, right? And frigates in the upper floor. So we have the boats floating, the frigates, the boats out on the sea that you could see floating. And she describes the ocean as the upper floor, and she's interested what's in the lower floor beneath the surface of the ocean, right? Extended hempen hands, presuming me to be a mouse aground upon the sands. Tiny little person in comparison to these giant ships. Some of them are maybe docked at port and they're tied up with rope, hemp, and we think about mice and rats going up on across the ropes into the boats and everything. So she's just playing around with this nautical, maritime, seaside imagery as much as she can. And the the idea, again, both the attraction and the threat of the human being in a very vulnerable position at this ocean. We talk about the sublime when we do the romantic unit in American Lit. We talk all the time, Emerson and Thoreau and others who are imparting that notion of the sublime, something that is overwhelmingly beautiful but also frightening at the same time. The stars at night, when you see them on a very darkened night and you're feeling very small and insignificant in the universe, the Grand Canyon or any sort of giant geological formation. Like, my God, that took how many lifetimes for that formation to erupt? Um, these are the sort of sublime elements. And the ocean is another one that is just so overwhelming and so overpowering. When we read the first part of the American Lit Survey, we read Melville, and he talks about this, the attraction of the ocean and the sea, as some sort of semblance of the overwhelming power of nature or the universe, right? And this universe, this ocean, comes upon her. She's describing herself in relation to the ocean and the sort of trivia, the everyday life of human beings, these boats, the commerce, the things that we do as humans that are separate from nature in some ways. And now she describes, but no man move me. So she's moved by all this nature, but no man move me till the tide went past my simple shoe. So the question we always have is, what does that mean, no man moved me? Is she talking about a literal man that she went to visit? There's lots of speculation about this. Um, this man or this physical presence moves her in the way that the ocean overwhelms and moves her. Regardless, she's about to get it on with the ocean, right? Till the tide went past my simple shoe and past my apron and my belt and past my bodice too. The voice in this poem, if you're imagining Emily Dickinson walking out in pretty formal attire and allowing the water to come up over her private parts, is pretty shocking, right? And she's into it. And made as he would eat me up. Okay, so he is obviously the antecedent here is the tide, but she also said, but no man moved me. So is it the man? Is it the tide? Is it the man as a tide? And made as he would eat me up, as wholly as a dew upon a dandelion sleeve. And then I started too. And I love that idea of comparison of the juxtaposition of the giant ocean, this overwhelming sort of force, and the tiny little drop of dew in the morning on the sleeve of a dandelion or on the leaf of a plant, right? Between the microcosm and the macrocosm, she finds in both circumstances some sublime, overwhelming encapsulation. Being swallowed up is a great image. And then I started too. So you have this sense that her life begins because of this connection with the tide, or is it with a man, or with this overwhelming force? I started too. And he followed close behind this idea of the threat of the ocean or the tide. I felt his silver heel, the waves. If you've been at the ocean, you know, you have that sensation when you're out there and the waves are lapping in and you walking along the shore and the sand is running underneath you and you lose your place. You don't know exactly where you're at. And then I love that idea of how the water comes back over your feet. And in this case, she's wearing her shoes upon my ankle. Then my shoes would overflow with pearl. You have that bubbling white sort of surf. That's a great expression of that idea, isn't it? Until we met the solid town, and now we're back to society, right? Then the sea withdraws. No one he seemed to know, and bowing with a mighty look at me, the sea withdrew. Is this her lover? is this the physical connection with nature. Going back into civilization takes her away from nature. Regardless, there's this idea of a very passionate sort of connection one way or the other. Okay, let's take some time to look at a very important poem that we probably otherwise would not have looked at. And this is a more obscure poem that's not as widely taught and discussed. It's getting more taught and discussed. But My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun. Um, Again, this is grouped in that love and desire things. And I don't know how you all feel about guns. Um, they're a very loaded, no pun intended, metaphor. They can be a sexual metaphor if you think about the way that a gun operates, a long cylindrical body which shoots things out of it. Make of that what you will. Um, and this poem is kind of an interesting juxtaposition of the weapon, the firearm, the gun that is protection, but also a source of food and sustenance, gets compared basically to companionship. And it could be that this poem is just Dickinson went there. She wanted to write a poem from the viewpoint of a gun, but probably it's meant also to sort of be an analogy for physical companionship with another human being, probably her, the voice of the poem, and this man. Um, here we go. My life had stood a loaded gun in corners, till a day the owner passed, identified, and carried me away. And now we roam in sovereign woods, and now we hunt the doe, and every time I speak for him, the mountains straight reply. And do I smile such cordial light upon the valley glow? It is as a Vesuvian face had let its pleasure through. And when at night, our good day done, I guard my master's head, 'tis better than the eider duck's deep pillow to have shared. To foe of his, I'm deadly foe. None stir the second time, on whom I lay a yellow eye or an emphatic thumb. Though I than he may longer live, he longer must than I. Sorry. For I have but the power to kill without the power to die. All right. So this is a poem that has many layers. Um, the idea of personifying a firearm, let's read the conventional sort of a way of thinking about this. It's just a curious way of describing a hunter who's out in a cabin somewhere and his favorite rifle or shotgun, right? Um, and regardless of how deep you descend into the metaphor here, there's this idea of the physical depiction of the hunter or the cabin dweller going out with this gun. We roam the sovereign woods. It is kind of a sylvan scene set in the woods, set in the outdoors. And now we hunt the doe. So we go from this, the gun is standing in the corner, it's just kind of laying there. It has all this potential. Keep that in mind, the idea of power and potential once the trigger is pulled, right? So the gun sits in the corner, and then the voice of the poem and the way it's transacted goes to kind of present tense. Now he's carrying me along, right? And now we roam the sovereign words, and now we hunt the doe. And every time I speak for him, the mountains straight reply. When the poems, uh, you know, Freudian slip. When the gun speaks, that means a shot is being fired, and you hear it echo across the wooded landscape, right? So every time I speak for him, the mountains straight reply. And do I smile such cordial light upon the valley glow? It is as a Vesuvian face had let its pleasure through. And when at night, okay, Mount Vesuvius, a volcano. So how do you describe the power coming out of this gun? A Vesuvian face. And smiling? What a weird sort of way to put that connection there with the idea of a gun being shot. It's a smile? Interesting. And do I smile such cordial light upon the valley glow? It is as a Vesuvian face had let its pleasure through. And when at night our good day done, I guard my master's head. Now the gun is in the corner serving as protection. 'Tis better than the eider duck's deep pillow to have the finest of down. It's the most comfortable thing to have this gun as protection. To foe as his, I'm deadly foe. None stir the second time. On whom I lay a yellow eye or an emphatic thumb. That's interesting, the juxtaposition there, because those are the things that the gun bearer would do. Like the person shooting the gun is the one who would use the yellow eye and the sight to shoot its target, the thumb to pull the trigger back or to press the trigger, right? And she's sort of in this moment of communion between the gun and the shooter, right? And they're kind of in one, in unison. Though I than he may longer live, he longer must than I, for I have but the power to kill without the power to die. Um, though though I than he may longer live, he longer must than I, for I have but the power to kill without the power to die. So even though this gun has this particular relationship with the shooter in the poem, um, once the shooter, it's dependent upon the shooter picking it up and pulling the trigger, right? And so therefore, the gun can only do its job. It can only sort of transcend death if the trigger is pulled. So it's reliant upon the shooter. Now, the shooter is mortal, so they're going to die. So at some point, that gun is going to sit in the corner and no longer be used and no longer come to life and no longer speak and no longer smile and all those sort of things. So that's kind of um, the deep sort of sentiment. The smile seems to be that the gun is happy to provide this service to protect and to sustain and feed the shooter. Um, and um, it's kind of that. Okay, so that's on one level. Now let's read the poem with too much sexual innuendo. And I already said, as a symbol, the gun is oftentimes intoned in literature as a phallic symbol. That is, it's meant to represent or analogize a penis that is exploding, right? So, but in a metaphorical sense, right? And there is a lot of sort of desirous or sort of sexualized language in here, I think, with the idea of the Vesuvian's face, the explosion of the gun, the smiling, the intimacy of being in that very soft bed with a gun nearby, the general sort of traditional symbol of what a gun means as far as a phallic image. Um, so that's another way to see it, as a kind of maybe an allusion to some sort of close companionship, perhaps physical companionship. But what about the idea that this could also be read as uh, within that other category of language and the role of the poet? Um, what if the gun symbolizes or analogizes her poems? We've seen this in so many of her poems, right? I present this poem across the ages. So, her poems are loaded guns, right? Her life, just as she had said, publication is the auction of the mind of man. She has imparted her life sense into these poems, and she's packed them in there. There's potential and power. They're going to go off at any moment. All you need is to pull the trigger. The poem is loaded. The trigger just needs to be pulled. Who's going to pull the trigger? You, my friend, the reader, pull the trigger. And then there's the eruption of whatever it is in this poem in specific or all her poetry. There's the eruption of her life. It stood a loaded gun in the corner, right? And so that at the end, the way that her poems come back to life is through readers picking them up and going and doing some target practice, I guess. So that's kind of the fascinating, complex, ineffable element of that poem that I really love. Okay, let's try another batch here and see how it goes. Okay, come up here. Very nice. Okay, yeah. Having a little trouble here. Sorry. This last group of poems that probably you're more familiar with and that kind of gets Dickinson her reputation is these poems that are dealing with pain and with loss and with death. And so let's take a look here. I'm having a little bit of trouble with my Zoom controls here. So I'll see if I can pull these down and share back on that document. And let's just go through these as quickly as we can. And I want to end with that one about truth and beauty. So we know in this set of poems, I never lost as much as twice. Speaking of loss, there's a certain slant of light. If we want to take a quick look at that, is to me that's like a tone poem. It's describing a moment. 320 or page 258 in my text. 320. Where are you at? 320. Okay, I see we've gotten much smaller here. Okay, let's go ahead. 320. There's a certain slant of light. Um, to me, I love reading this poem because it imparts a sense of light and darkness. And you know how we had talked about how there's that notion of the I'm sorry, I'm having problems here again. View, gallery. I'm really messing up my Zoom here. Um, okay, hold on. Stop. Okay, I really screwed that up. But here we have, there's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it, any, 'tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. So this idea of this fleeting moment of pain, and I don't know if you get that sense of melancholy or longing. I imagine the slant of light coming through like a barn where you see the little streams of light coming through the cracks in the wood or whatever. There's a certain just winter afternoons. Everything is trying to just impart this idea of being downhearted, and also trying to sort of light up and get past this pain or suffering and this sense that eventually light will come back in. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar. So it's not a physical scar, it's an emotional scar. Maybe she's describing depression, but internal difference where the meanings are, right? None may teach it any, 'tis the seal despair, an imperial infliction sent us from the area, in uh, uh, the publication, publication is the auction of the mind of man. That has that sort of image of the, sorry, I shouldn't have done that. That has the image of the, the idea of the imperial air as well. Well, I'm really screwing up the Zoom controls here, but I hope we got that sort of sense of that poem is trying to capture the sense of depression or pain or loss. Um, the other one is uh, I felt a funeral. I mean, we have other poems we could look at there where she's just describing that sensation of being in pain. After great pain, on page 372, where's that one? A little bit further down here, 372. You see how they have the dual numbers there? 372. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. A lot of interest in that sort of marble-like image of, or granite or stone, right? The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore, and yesterday or centuries before? The feet mechanical go round a wooden way of ground or air or aught, regardless grown, a quartz contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead. All the imagery is about just being dragged when you're in grief, um, pain. Like you just, it's hard. You wake up in the morning and you have this moment when you suddenly have a realization that you've lost someone or you've experienced a loss and it just overwhelms you. Freezing persons recollect the snow, first chill, then stupor, and then letting go. So both of those poems describe how eventually you get out of this torment of the pain. Um, and pain has an element of blank. Let's take a look at, there's so many of the death poems, and we won't go through all these, but the uh, the one that I think you probably are most familiar with is Because I Could Not Stop for Death, and we also talked about the I Heard a Fly Buzz poem, where we see Dickinson sort of, in one sense, having a fairly positive view, an eternal view of death, a kind of spiritual reconnection with the cosmos. And in the other one, you have the idea that maybe Dickinson is flirting with the idea that, when we die, we just become, back to the term corporeal, we just become a physical body that decays. I think the one that is most interesting in this regard is 280. I felt a funeral in my brain, and several of you wrote about this in your uh, discussion forum posts. And one thing that we think about with 280 um, is this notion. Oh, I'm having trouble finding it. 280. Where are you at, 280? 280. Is it up here? I felt a funeral in my brain. Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm really losing it. I've been talking too long about these poems. So I'll try and wrap up here. So I felt a funeral in my brain is just a wonderful poem because it is associating depression, um, anxiety, pain with the thing that probably is causing the pain, this understanding of the human condition, our own mortality. So, what better imagery or allegory to use than to describe a funeral as a way of something going on in your head? And that's kind of the image, right? So, I felt a funeral in my brain and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed my sense was breaking through. So she's describing this sensation in her own mind. And don't you love the onomatopoeia there of the, and mourners to and fro kept treading. And if you've had a depressive element or maybe even a physical headache or something like that, that idea of something going on in your brain, you can't get outside of it. You can't get unfixated on it. She really gives a great sense of that with the mourners to and fro, treading till it seemed the sense was breaking through. And later on, when we see the casket drop, because that's what happens at funerals, right? Um, we have the casket drop, or we have it not drop. That's kind of the idea or the image that she's sharing here. And when they all were seated for the service, a service like a drum kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll. As all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I in silence some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank and reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then. Um, so this idea that the head is resonating with all this pain and suffering, um, ringing like a bell, isn't that great imagery there? The mind was going numb, the drum. It's a great poem to read for that sort of element of sound sense. This idea, though, that when we talk about it in class, sometimes we really get into the details about like what does she mean about she is like a receptacle for all the pain in the world. It's coming through her brain. It's like a bell ringing. It's like she's the ear hearing all these things. And I and silence, some strange race wrecked solitary here, all by yourself. Nobody else can experience it. Nobody can know with you. You are isolated supremely in this moment of pain or grief. And then a plank and reason broke. So I think about the plank that's holding up the coffin, but in this case, the analogy is towards reason. And maybe we're starting to see a diminishment of the pain. The plank and reason broke, and I dropped down and down again in the brain. Her body is like in the casket, in the funeral, in her brain, dropping down, but it's also outside. It's really interesting. And hit a world at every plunge, just sort of being in the mindscape, trying to think about what she's experiencing as she drops through this consciousness, and finish knowing with the then set off by the dashes. It's so finished knowing it's like an end, but it's not an end. It continues after that. I just find that a very interesting sort of juxtaposition. Um, I got two poems I want to finish up with. I'm going to finish with the one that was discussed a great deal in the comments. I Died for Beauty. And let's see, that is 448. 448. So is this down here? 448. So for some reason, this really attracted a lot of attention in the forum. I died for beauty, but was scarce adjusted in the tomb when one who died for truth was lain in an adjoining room. He questioned softly why I failed. For beauty, I replied, and I for truth themselves are one. We brethren are, he said. And so, as kinsmen met at night, we talked between the rooms until the moss had reached our lips and covered up our names. Um, I love that sort of idea. Again, just like with the funeral in the brain, it's an abstract notion of trying to take this idea of uh, you know this idea of uh, the concepts, the analogies of truth and beauty being personified and, shall we say, corpseified. They're being treated as two bodies that have been laid in adjoining tombs, in sepulchers. And there's this idea that over the length of time, moss grows up over the names and the identity of the truth and the beauty. And you can imagine, as a person, truth was laid to rest and beauty was laid to rest, and then the moss going up over their names and kind of silences them there at the end when their identity is obscured, but it's still, they're still there underneath the moss. There's a lot of sort of analogies that you can develop with this. But the one thing that we probably needed to make a more explicit connection with is Keats's poem Ode on a Grecian Urn, and the romantic notion, which we talked quite a bit about in the first part of the American Lit Survey, about this romantic notion that there is some sort of spiritual element in the world, that nature and truth is out there if we can access it. Emerson described this in his poem or in his essay Nature, and quite famously with the transparent eyeball, he describes being out in nature, and he's uplifted into infinite space. He becomes a transparent eyeball. He is one part and particle with the universe. It flows through him and flows out of him, and you can't describe, you can't share, you can't define what this truth is. The truth comes about in the beauty that's expressed, the wholeness, whatever it is that nature teaches us in the patterns and the way it's arranged, there's a truth to that. And you don't know it for sure what is true, you just sense it. And the way that it is discussed in the most traditional sense is with the John Keats poem, and so I'm going to share that with you here. Ode on a Grecian Urn. Um, and here we have this image of um, the uh, the urn itself, the vase, the Greek pottery that has preserved upon it a scene of two lovers that are about to kiss. And in the background, as described in the poem, there's all these things going on. It's a pastoral scene, it's a wedding festival. And the point is that this vase preserves this moment of contact, not quite when they're kissing, not after they're kissing, but right at that moment when we anticipate the kiss, and everything that's described outside of the scene, people playing the timbres and the violins and celebrating this wonderful union of two people. And it also suggests that the art, in some ways, preserves the moment better than even reality. Art gives an impression, an idea of what it means to be in love, an idea of what it means to be physically intimate, to kiss, an idea of what it means to be in society and celebrating this wedding, this part of our human existence that's going on all the way back 2,000 years previous to when this vase was put together. There's this beautiful image. People made this image, and like the poems we were talking about with Dickinson that go on past her lifetime, that go on and are resurrected when we read them, which are the gun that we pull the trigger on and they blow up and we have this experience. That's the kind of thing that Keats is getting at in this poem. And so when he says, "Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, Sylvan historian, who can thus express, who can explain to me what is actually going on this the scene on this vase, other than we know it's two lovers about to kiss. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, always at that moment of perfection, right? Heard melodies are sweet. It's wonderful to hear the music, but those unheard are sweeter, therefore, because we can't see on the scene what is being, we can't hear the song that was actually played at the wedding. If you see a snapshot of a wedding photo or whatever, you don't have all the music and all the chaos in the background. But if you in art can impart that notion, you can supply your own music, right? So it is a poem about the romantic notion of art somehow being able to show us through its depiction of nature and our interactions with nature and humans within the natural world doing their human thing. Art somehow makes it more perfect, preserves the moment more perfectly, and it becomes a moment of truth, right? Happy, happy bows. The bold lover, never canst thou kiss. So even though you'll never be able to kiss her, we're preserved in this most perfect moment, right? She cannot fade, she won't die, the art will be preserved forever. Thou, though thou hast not thy bliss, forever wilt thou love, uh, and she be fair. She's not going to age. You're not going to age. You see what I'm getting at? The idealism or the perfection of art can preserve some moment of that. And so the poem ends after all this expression of this ode, this celebration of this piece of art that captures this human moment. Beauty is truth, truth is beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all you need to know. And this was what year? This is like 1808 or something like that. And Dickinson's poems are much later. She certainly would have known John Keats's poetry. And so she's takes this is her own take on that notion of the Grecian urn of eternity sort of being preserved in a moment of art. And I think that's what she means by truth and beauty as an allegory. But we can get back into the question of he questioned softly why he failed. Truth, why did truth fail? Why did beauty fail? You know, sometimes in life we can't have everything, I guess is the expression, right? And so he questions softly why I failed. Why did truth die? Why did beauty die? That's the kind of thing you want to sort of get into when you're trying to sort of interact with the poem. Um, um, but the the don't the association with that concept from Keats is important to keep in mind there as well. Um, I wanted to finish, and if people don't want to sort of spend time with this, no worries. But I think that this is a fun poem. 1096, A Narrow Fellow in the Grass, because it, to me, we're getting ready to do this in um, the elements of literature and critical approaches to literature here on Friday. And those of you who've discussed this poem with me are probably familiar with this reading, but I think it is a good poem because it's a fun poem, but it has more significance and it maybe addresses some of those issues of gender identity and feminism and other things that a couple of you were picking up in the forum as well. And I don't think that anybody wrote about this poem because this was in the first selection that we had with the nature poems. So, a narrow fellow in the grass occasionally rides. Okay, so let's take a look at this. I'm gonna check my notes here, make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. A narrow fellow in the grass occasionally rides. You may have met him, did you not? His notice instant is. The grass divides as with a comb, a spotted shaft is seen, and then it closes at your feet and opens further on. He likes a boggy acre, a floor too cool for corn. But when a boy and barefoot, I more than once at noon have passed, I thought, a whiplash, unbraiding in the sun, when stooping to secure it, it wrinkled and was gone. Several of nature's people I know, and they know me. I feel for them a transport of cordiality, but never met this fellow, attended or alone, without a tighter breathing and zero at the bone. So, what we got going on here in this poem, it's kind of fun to decipher and unpack, is that you have the person or the speaker in the poem we know is a boy. The poet is not a boy. So, this is an important lesson for us to remember to keep in mind the persona, the voice of a poem or the speaker of the poem is not necessarily the author themselves. But we might ask as well if the poem has some intonations that Dickinson might, having been associated with passionate, perhaps physical relationships with both men and women, maybe she in her day or in this day she might identify as gender non-specific. She might identify as trans. She might identify as bi. She might identify as asexual. There's some fluidity that's going on here, and it may or may not be relevant. But there's also some kind of some people can see some sexualized imagery in this poem. So let's reread it and point to a couple of things here. First of all, it is a puzzle to unpack, but we should figure out pretty soon that we are describing a snake. And if you're Emily Dickinson, you're not just going to describe a snake, you're going to describe snakiness. So the language of the poem and the imagery of the poem is snaky, right? It's not the literal snake, it's everything that the snake does. And it's brilliant because that's the thing with snakes. Why are we so frightened with snakes in society? Well, you can go back to the idea of Adam and Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And people just don't like snakes because of their movement. They're very quick, and oftentimes you don't see them. And particularly if you're out in the grass, and in this case, the speaker of the poem's not wearing any shoes, and you see the grass doing that thing, man, that can be pretty worrisome for people. You don't know where this snake is coming from, right? So she's describing the snakiness by not identifying the snake itself, but the influence and impact it has on the natural environment around it, right? A narrow fellow in the grass occasionally rides. You may have met him, did you not? His notice instant is. That's the thing with snakes. They kind of creep up on you, and then only when you almost step on it, it kind of scurries away, right? The grass divides as with a comb, a spotted shaft is seen, and then it closes at your feet and opens further on. So if you're out in the grass and it's moving because there's a critter in there, that makes you nervous. And then having it go underneath you and between your legs can be even more nervous. Now, this is where some people choose to see some sexualized imagery as well, because we talked about the gun perhaps being a phallic image. Oftentimes, a snake, a long pointed sort of object. Fleshy object, it can be a phallic image. And in this case, the language can be kind of, seemingly sexualized. The grass divides as with a comb, a spotted shaft is seen, and then it closes at your feet and opens further on. But, more than likely, Dickinson is just trying to describe what it's like to see the snake in the grass, not the snake itself, but the grass dividing and things like that. If you did want to sort of go down this path with the sexualized language, you might sort of make a case that the poet, knowingly or unknowingly, is expressing a little bit of gender trouble here because there's this idea of it being the voice of a boy, and perhaps this, we'll get to Freud later, right? But perhaps the poet is unintentionally describing phallic imagery because maybe the poet or Dickinson is imagining what it's like to be a boy, to have a snake, so to speak, right? So there's something that could be going on with that idea of the sexualized imagery. Um, but when a boy and barefoot, I more than once at noon have passed, I thought, a whiplash unbraiding in the sun. When stooping to secure it, it wrinkled and was gone. And so there's that idea of the snake being so quick and they can disappear so quickly. Now, the speaker in this poem loves nature. This is a young boy who puts frogs in his pocket, is wearing no shoes out in nature, and loves all of nature, isn't afraid of bugs, but snakes frighten this kid as it frightens most people. So why is that? The poem is kind of engaging this question. Several of nature's people, and don't you love the personification there? Several of nature's people I know, and they know me. I feel for them a transport of cordiality. We're friendly towards each other, right? But never met this fellow attended or alone without a tighter breathing and zero at the bone. So a literal reading of that final stanza is, but never met this fellow attended or alone. And with Dickinson, there's ambiguity because are you saying never met this fellow when I'm by myself as a little boy, or I have my friends with me and I'm still frightened? Or are there multiple snakes? So this fellow and another fellow and another fellow. A lot of snakes are probably creepy to a lot of people, right? But never met this fellow attended or alone without a tighter breathing and zero at the bone. So the poem is just trying to sort of describe that moment of fright when you encounter a snake. But this is the brilliance of Dickinson. Zero at the bone. What does that describe? She could have easily said chilled to the bone. That's what being frightened is like, right? That's the metaphor we're used to, being chilled to the bone. But zero at the bone is so much better. And do you know why? It's because like this. Let me show you something here. I usually draw this on the board. So if you take a drawing of a snake skeleton, if you see a snake skeleton in the museum here on campus or whatever, you'll notice that there are ribs and they don't enclose in full circles, but you have a spine and you have ribs. This is my snake. Okay. So ribs, the ribs that go along the spine of the snake, and that's part of why I think people are creeped out by snakes because they don't have legs, and yet how are they able to move so quickly across the ground, right? Um, but does that not look zeros at the bone, right? Zeros at the bone. Um, Chill to the bone, zero to the bone, zero at the bone. And if you're still on that sexualized kick, you can think about the sexual innuendo of having a zero and having a bone. Okay. So those are the way. Also, in feminist studies, you may have encountered this concept of the lack and how in feminist perspectives, women are oftentimes, this is the penis envy sort of thing. It's all been discounted, but from a Freudian perspective, like the woman is described as being lesser than because she has a lack. She has a zero. The males in society have something that sticks out and that is prominent and that is, aggro and is male and is dominant because it is a thing that is visible and is powerful and is plain and again is the bone. Whereas the woman is the zero or the receptacle, one is in a power differential over the other. And so, could all those things be going on at the same time in that pretty simple, straightforward, and fun, almost childlike poem? Why not? That's why we're in literary studies to begin with. And if the poem, intentionally or not, is bringing up, even in the way you read it, and you literally are able to decipher that, or something that's happening in your brain when you read the poem and it impacts you in a subsurface level, and you just have this imagery. That's what art does, right? And Emily Dickinson was a true artist, and she set her gun aside for us to pull the trigger on. Years later, she set her poems aside with faith that they would be discovered and admired, and they are. And in this way, she is resurrected. She's with us today. Her art lives with us today, and she's an important voice, an important female voice that lives on, and one of our most important poets in the American literary canon. That's the end of my long-winded exploration of Emily Dickinson. You probably didn't enjoy this, but I did. I love talking about these poems. I'll see you all in class next time we meet.